Matthew 24, they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. Matthew 24 extends the pattern that we've been talking about, the pattern of Jesus' judgment declared on the rebellious Jewish nation. And for a number of chapters now, Jesus talks about woe and the impending righteous judgment of God upon them for both rejecting and not following his law, obeying his words from their heart, but more significantly, rejecting his Messiah, the Messiah to which the law points. Now, part of that would be the Jewish pride in the temple. And this is a sacred building. We see earlier in the book of Matthew some discussion about that, whether Jesus will pay the temple tax. And Jesus' answer is, well, I'm actually the Son of the Father. That's my temple. Jesus cleansing the temple twice. He has that kind of authority so that he can say, do not make my house a den of thieves. It should be a place for prayer. Or Jesus even saying that something greater than the temple is here. The Messiah fulfills everything that the temple pointed to. And that even explains some of the really interesting language when Jesus will refer to his body as a temple. Do you remember the critical charge that was brought up against Jesus at his trial? That he had said he would tear the temple down and in 3 days it would be built up again. And actually then the Gospels tell us he was referring to the temple of his body. But that wasn't just language that people used, calling their bodies temples. This was Jesus making a point. Jesus fulfills everything that the temple represents. Now, I do think it helps us, however, to get a little bit of a visual picture of what we're talking about when we even discuss the temple. This is, of course, a model. The actual temple was destroyed millennia ago. But it gives us, I think, an idea, anyway, of what it would look like to see the building. And it's magnificent. Recognizing the history of the temple, Solomon's temple was much greater. It was destroyed in the Babylonian conquest. Then it's rebuilt, and we read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah, the return to Jerusalem, the building up of the walls, the rebuilding of the temple, so that at the conclusion, there's great joy and people rejoicing that the temple is back again. Remember, there is the older generation also, however, who remembers the original temple. And they weep because it's so much smaller. Time has gone by. Herod has added to the temple, and it's bigger and more magnificent now. So there's plenty to be proud of with this temple. And that's what's happening when we come to Matthew 24. The disciples are quite proud and quite impressed with the magnificence of this temple. Remember, most of Jesus' ministry has been in Galilee. Now they've come down to Judea, so you've come down to kind of the center of things, the greatest city across Palestine. And so the disciples going in are impressed and in awe at, look at this beautiful sight, something that it's not like they're seeing regularly, and enjoying the vision of this temple. For the fullest context, you really have to go all the way back to chapter 21. This is the chapter about the triumphal entry. And Jesus enters the temple and he begins to engage with the chief priests and the elders of the people. That's chapter 21. Now you're going forward, and all that falls in between is his interaction with them, actually debating with them. And it's finally when we come around to the end here, the end of chapter 23, Jesus cries out judgment on Jerusalem, and he leaves saying, you will not see me again until the distant future when you see the Messiah returning. Jesus left the temple. So you see, this is kind of the bookend going all the way really in the literary framework here, all the way back to chapter 21, Jesus entering the temple. When he leaves the temple and he's going away, his disciples come out to him to point out the buildings of the temple. Look at this, isn't this extraordinary? Jesus answers, you see all of this. I'm telling you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. What's he referring to? Well, the disciples want to know that themselves. And so verse 3, They ask him privately. I think that's interesting. It's following the pattern we've seen throughout here, that Jesus focuses on the disciples. So apart from all of the Pharisees and apart from all of the crowds, privately they ask him, and they receive a personalized or private explanation. When will these things be, they want to know. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? These are really two different questions. When will these things most naturally refers to some of the details that Jesus is talking about here. When will these things be? The judgment upon the city and the destruction of the temple. And they assume that that must be also the sign of Jesus coming and of the end of the age. And Jesus is going to explain actually that these are separate things, but they're related. And we'll return to that concept in just a notion, in just a moment. But let me mention one or two things on the way there. When Jesus talks about not one stone left upon another, what he's referring to is an event that's going to happen within the lifetimes of the disciples. He's speaking probably around 30 AD. So then around that era, around the time of his death, he's looking ahead and he's prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem that comes in 70. Roughly 40 years later. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. Titus, a Roman general, comes to Jerusalem dealing with the rebellion of the Jewish people. There's a protracted war that turns very nasty. And the end of that war is the destruction of Jerusalem. It's commemorated here in a famous painting from the 1850s. And this, of course, is just an artist's depiction, but kind of a picture of what it might look like. Of course, the reality of it is more that the Roman army is surrounding the outside of the city and surrounding these gates. There's a constant back and forth, siege ramps and people digging underneath to destroy the siege ramps, and back and forth, back and forth. But eventually it does result in a great fire and the temple is destroyed. In fact, you can go to parts of Jerusalem today and you can see stones that have been cast down. The Roman soldiers in AD 70 did this. These are stones that were taken apart and cast down, representing the destruction of Jerusalem going all the way back to this time. Jesus predicted it. This is what happened. And this is part of what's being discussed in this chapter, the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, let me pause on that for just a moment. I want us to recognize some patterns in the chapter, and then I want us to recognize a particular challenge of this chapter. And starting first with the challenge, here's the difficulty of the chapter. We're left sometimes wondering what happened to the chronology. As in, at times the chronology seems a little mixed up. And we read certain things and think that it refers to the distant future, as in the return of Christ, or we might refer to the tribulation, as we'll see within this chapter later. And at other times we're reading, and it sounds like we're talking about something more proximate, the destruction of Jerusalem. Let me show you what I mean, and then we'll look at this in closer detail. So the most natural reading in this first section of the account is that Jesus is speaking directly to the disciples. We read things like, "See that no one leads you astray. And they will lead many astray. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Do not be alarmed." So Jesus seems to be speaking directly to them. And he talks about things that are actually fulfilled during the lifetimes of the disciples. I mean, certainly wars and rumors of wars, these kinds of things happened. Nations rising against nations, kingdom against kingdoms, famines, earthquakes in various places. That's on some level always been happening. And Jesus' comment, all these are but the beginnings of the birth pang. The recognition that there's far more and far more serious judgment to come. He talks about the martyrdom of the apostles, being hated by all nations for my name's sake. Many fall away, many false prophets, and leading many astray, and the love of many will grow cold. All of this sounds like it could be easily fulfilled within the lifetimes of the disciples or soon after. A comment that I'll pause on for just a moment. You'll recognize a pattern throughout this and other sections on the worldwide scope of Jesus' teaching. When he says things like, "You will be hated by all nations," why would that be? And how would the kingdom be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations? And it is Jesus already talking about the reality that the good news about him will spread. It's not just a Jewish reality. It will spread across to the entire world. Now, if all of that section sounds like it's something fulfilled more proximately the lives of the apostles, the next section sounds rather different. Starting in verse 15 and running further down in the chapter, we start hearing language that sounds more eschatological, future, distant, tribulation, end times. So that you hear language like the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. And that refers to a recurring pattern in Daniel, where Daniel talks about a horrifying abomination, a horrifying deed that will be done. Taking advantage or destroying things in the temple and defiling the temple. And if you make some connections, both in Daniel and later in Revelation, actually turning the temple into a place of idolatry. Now, could that be fulfilled in AD 70 when the temple is destroyed? Potentially. But there seems to be something more. The idea of the temple being used for idolatry that was never fulfilled. And furthermore, Daniel has some greater links out into really future end times kind of expectations. So there's something more happening here. When Jesus talks about flying out into the wilderness, and then most significantly, he talks about the great tribulation that's coming. Or in verse 27, when he talks about lightning coming down from the east and shining as far as the west. I mean, you get the impression here, the Son of Man is coming. You get the impression here that something more significant is going on. We're talking about really kind of the end of time. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. None of this sounds like something that's already happened back in AD 70. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. How can any of this have been fulfilled back in AD 70? Another passing comment. I referred earlier to the worldwide scope of things. Well, it's interesting that even here you see some of that pattern. So certainly the sun being darkened and the stars falling from heaven, this is not a localized thing. This is an earth thing. And even clearer, all the tribes of the earth will mourn. He will come and he will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. This doesn't sound like a Jewish thing. Something bigger is going on. Now, this is the difficulty of Matthew 24. As one reads, you're not exactly sure, are we talking about the close future, as in the coming events of the temple being destroyed, or are we talking about the very distant future of Jesus' return and the end of all things? And that makes us face some challenges here. I think the basic answer and the way we ought to proceed in Matthew 24 is to recognize that on some level, both are in view and they're related. Let me explain what I mean. I've already referred to the fact that there are significant differences between these events. The reality that AD 70 is something fulfilled within the lifetime of the disciples, and that the distant future or the tribulation is something far more difficult and far more shocking in its implications. The total destruction across planet Earth of so much, whereas the temple destroyed is really a localized thing. But I would like to highlight also here that there are some significant similarities between these two events. And part of what's going on in Matthew is that Jesus is highlighting these two events as kind of parallels. The destruction of the temple, a small beginning, a small picture, just kind of a model for the full reality when the temple will be desecrated, when the temple will not just be destroyed, but actually used for idolatry, and when the entire world now will come together in rebellion against God, and the entire world will face his judgment. Keeping in mind then, both the differences between these two events and the similarities between these two events, helps us explain much of what's going on in this passage. I'll start out with some of the similarities, and this is striking. Both events involve destruction, rather total destruction. In the case of Jerusalem and the temple, the city is essentially burned. It is, and the temple is entirely burned. And many people die. Probably a valid estimate is somewhere around 1 million people are killed. Many others taken into captivity. It's a horrifying event. Absolutely horrifying. And if you read some of Josephus's accounts, I thought of including this in this lecture, and I stopped because I think it would bother you. That's the nature of how horrifying this event was. Well, so also the future. Both will come quickly and without recourse, and really without any other reprieve. Jesus warns in respect to both that you ought to be prepared, and when that time comes, run. In fact, he highlights that in some cases, by the time it comes, it's really basically too late. Both come quickly. And in both cases, one would be shocked and be seeking reprieve, recourse, but find none. And finally, both are connected to God's judgment for sin. God judges Israel. God judges the world. But there are some differences, and these differences are really significant. Now, one of the differences works like this. Jesus, in one case, will talk about being aware of the judgment and seeing some of the signs of the coming judgment. So this here at the beginning in verses 32 and 34 is actually a warning. He says, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender, you know that summer is near. I mean, there's a way to look at what's happening and expect this is what it means. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. It gives you the sense of this is a predictable thing, a thing that you can expect. You can watch for the signs, and when those signs are there, then you'll have a sense that it's right around the corner. And then it turns, and in verse 36 and following, concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, the Father only. Jesus is the one speaking, and all throughout the book, we've seen Jesus' power and authority, and that he knows all things. And here we have one thing at least, that he'll confess not even he knows the day or the hour. And just follow the pattern of unaware, or you do not know. Or if you had known, then you would not have allowed it to happen. But the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. You won't be able to prepare for this. The servant or the master returns on a day when he does not expect, and an hour he does not know. All of this sounds entirely different and actually opposite to the initial statement, that it is possible to know and to see certain signs. So what's going on with this? And I think even just that is a little bit of an indicator already that there's a difference here between talking about Jerusalem and its destruction and the destruction of everything else. The destruction of Jerusalem is something that you can anticipate. You might look at the signs, you might notice the details and recognize, aha, this is it. But the coming of the Son of Man is something you cannot anticipate nor know. Now, there is one passage that I think it's critical for us to recognize, understand, and explain. And that is when Jesus talks about this, the possibility of anticipating and expecting the destruction of Jerusalem. This part of the passage could be challenging. And I think this is the understanding I'd like you to come to in appreciating what's happening here. Jesus talks about knowing that summer is near. When you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. And then Jesus comments, I say to you truly, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So what exactly is he referring to here? Particularly the comment, this generation will not pass away. What does that mean? How could that be fulfilled? And here, I think we're helped by noticing a particular expression. Jesus refers to seeing all these things. When you see all these things, then you know he is near. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And it's just interesting to notice the pattern going backwards that relates to this. When will all these things be? What will the sign of your coming be? In fact, actually, the story is deeper still. You can go back to chapter 23. And chapter 23 talks about the murder of the prophets from the Old Testament and the murder of the prophets or wise men and scribes that Jesus will send. And then Jesus comments, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Following that, then, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, mourning Jerusalem's rebellion and its destruction. These things talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the judgment that must come for its sin. And my understanding then of these things, AD 70. All these that will be destroyed, when will these things be? Well, particularly the stones tossed down, the buildings of the temple destroyed, those things. And Jesus' comment then a number of verses later, when you see all these things, and when all these things take place. So I'm understanding this to refer to the generation of the disciples and those around the time of Jesus. But the result of those things happening then is that you will know when Jerusalem is destroyed, you know that he is near at the very gates. And who is he? The basic concept of Jesus' words here, he's pointing to his own coming. And the concept goes then that this generation will see the destruction of Jerusalem. This generation will see the destruction of this city and all the horrifying results thereof. When you see those horrifying things, then you know that everything is cleared out of the way. And at any point after that, Jesus says, I can return. Be prepared. My return is near at the very door. I want to show you then one other set of patterns that brings us down to our conclusion and the point of this chapter. So the pattern we've already seen before, talking about Jesus coming, the end, and the tribulation. Let me just show you a group of expressions highlighting this within the passage we're looking at. Jesus talking about his coming is constant. What will be the sign of your coming? They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So will be the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the Son of Man. Your Lord is coming. And with all of these points, I think it's extremely significant and striking that you can talk about the Son of Man coming, the Lord coming, and all of this going back to the end of all things, Jehovah coming to judge his people. So the concept of coming, pointing to Jesus' return. That's related to a second pattern, and that is the end of the age. The end is not yet. The one who endures to the end will be saved, and then the end will come. The end of what? The answer is, well, the end of the world, the end of everything. That end will come with an additional pattern, and that's the pattern of tribulation. They will deliver you up to tribulation, great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. This concept that it's unprecedented, nothing like this has happened before, is a critical part of Jesus' teaching. And immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. We're talking about the end of the world. And by tribulation, we're talking about great judgment, horrifying destruction that comes about at the end of all things. Well, what then is our response? And we've emphasized earlier the fact that you cannot know the timing of this. Now, clarification. We saw in verse 32 that there is a sense that you can know something. You can know that Jesus is not returning until at least the events of AD 70. And that's part of Jesus' point. When will all these things be, and what is the sign of your coming, they ask. And Jesus answered, well, here's when the destruction of Jerusalem will happen, but it points to something much bigger than that. The judgment upon the world. When you see the destruction of Jerusalem, when you see all these things that Jesus talked about, then you know that something bigger is near at the very gates. And from there, the pattern goes, you cannot know. No one knows. You do not know. The master of the house, if he had known, he would have been prepared, but he can't know. And therefore, the servant must be prepared because the master comes on a day he does not know and a day he does not expect. One of the basic emphases of this chapter is that you cannot know with certainty or anticipate with confidence the return of Christ. And that becomes important for Jesus' challenge to them and to the challenge for us. The basic challenge of the passage then goes, you have to be perpetually ready. Let me show you just in one of Jesus' parables or one paragraph his explanation of that. So Jesus gives this in parable form, faithful and wise servant whom the master has set over his household. And that servant ought to be diligent. Blessed is the servant who's prepared when he comes. Okay, the when he comes is linking this parable up to what we've discussed, Jesus' return. If that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed. Okay, and that's an interesting insight in there, isn't it? A little bit of an implication that even though Jesus can return at any point, there might be a delay. Just recognize and be ready. And if that servant begins to beat his fellow servant and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect, at an hour he does not know, and he'll deal with them, and he'll bring about judgment. And the conclusion of that then is one has to be ready, constantly ready at any point. Elsewhere, Jesus talks about being awake, like a homeowner who doesn't know that the thief is coming. And you have to be alert and be ready. And the interesting thing about that particular metaphor and that language is that it gets picked up in the rest of the New Testament. So that if we extend onwards from Matthew 24 and we move out into the New Testament, we find patterns like this. We are not of the night or of the darkness, so that that day would surprise us like a thief. I mean, that's actually lifted right out of Matthew 24, the parable of the master of the house and the thief that would break in. So then let us not sleep. Let us keep awake and be sober. Since we belong to the day, let us be sober. Let us be prepared because we are to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. 2 Peter chapter 3, the day of the Lord will come like a thief. You've got that language back again. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God? And again, our point here is to say the very fact that it is coming, the end, the tribulation, Jesus' return, the judgment that will be inevitable and that will fall on planet Earth, all of those who have been rebellious will be judged. That very fact drives us then to be alert, awake, and ready. You don't know when he's coming. You'll have to be ready all the time. Similarly, continuing on in 2 Peter 3, then since you are waiting, be diligent to be found by him, without spot or blemish and at peace. Similarly, Revelation 3, wake up and strengthen what remains. If you will not wake up, I will come like a thief. You will not know at what hour I will come against you. I mean, it sounds like it's just lifted out of Matthew 24. Or finally, Revelation 16:15, behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeps his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. And the beautiful logic of Jesus' words in Matthew 24, and extended out through the rest of the New Testament, is that he is coming back soon. He's coming back on a day you don't expect. No, you can't know. You can't look out and pin a date and be able to designate when he comes. If you did, then you could just relax and do nothing and at the last minute try to be ready. No, it won't work like that. He'll come on a day you don't expect. So how then must you live? You must live in a constant state of readiness. Be prepared at every moment. Be alert. Be awake. Your master returns on a day when you do not know. Better keep the house in order. Better be prepared so that at any moment, at any time of his return, you would be found before him blameless. And the challenge of Matthew 24 Knowing the imminent coming of our Lord, be ready. The Son of Man is coming with power in the clouds and with great glory. He's coming in majesty to reign. When he comes, he will bring judgment. When he comes, he will hold accountable all that have been rebellious against him and all who are not ready. He's coming with power and great glory. Are you ready? Be prepared for the return of the Son of Man.